Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today, I'm going to talk about how men and women often view retirement differently. And before we get to that, I will tell you to subscribe. My most recent subscriber episode was all about love addiction. And if that sounds like uncomfortably like something that you would identify with, then it is a great episode. It discusses love addiction, the overlap with sex addiction, who becomes a love addict, etc. All right, so how do men and women view retirement frequently? Well, from what I see, there's usually a partner who wants to use this to be kind of in a different phase of life with new challenges, and then there's a partner that doesn't want any challenges. And this can co-vary based on sensitivity. The highly sensitive person who's the, quote, deeper thinker in the relationship often wants, kind of a different stage of life to happen. They're not done living yet, and they want new challenges. So, for example, they might want a different career, or they might want to, volunteer in some capacity that is new to them, or they might want to learn more, be a lifelong learner at a college or something in audit classes. They may want to live somewhere else, have a new adventure in that way. And then the other partner wants to relax. They feel that they have done the bulk of what they're meant to do. They've raised their children, they've had their career, and they're done. They want to enjoy themselves. It's very pleasure-based. And that doesn't mean that they certainly won't help with grandchildren, because they often do, and there's no difference between those two types on who helps more with grandchildren, because there's some people who are basically assume that will be the most fun thing, and then they'll want to help all the time, and that gives them pleasure. And then there's people who find deep meaning from helping their children with grandchildren. So that could be either type of person, and then either type of person could not want to. So the person who wants to, go into a second career would not really be around to help often with grandchildren. And the one who is just kind of hanging out more with friends and taking a walk every day would have the time. So it doesn't, or it could be vice versa. The one who's traveling for pleasure and fun then doesn't want to stop taking cruises to hang out with the kids and grandkids, and the other one would. So those are the overall divisions based on high sensitivity. But obviously there are gender differences as well, which is why I did this podcast. What I've seen is that men tend to want there to be more focus on the couple, and women tend to want there to be more focus on the family. And so that is superimposed on the other main effect of kind of high sensitivity or being the deeper thinker in the relationship. So the one that wants more couple time frequently thinks that this is going to be some sort of a renaissance of a deep connection between the couple now that there's nothing else on their plates. And that's often the man, because as I've said many times, the man is going to be more sexually driven generally at that stage of life. And of course, it's not just about sex, but if you have the sex hormones around, you're also more interested in romance. It's interesting because when men and women have kind of equivalent sex hormones, obviously women never have the testosterone men have, but when they're both in their prime hormonally before things start decreasing, then women are more often the preoccupied attachment partner, as I've talked about. But around 40, it switches. And women's hormones start to change, and they no longer are usually as preoccupied attachment as they were. And that's when sometimes the couple switches, so that the guy who was more avoidant when he was younger, because she was always trying to hang out with him, he is now, he is the more preoccupied partner himself, because he says, she never wants to hang out. And by the way, she also doesn't want sex. And all this stuff that I took for granted about her wanting to hang out all the time, she doesn't want to hang out all the time. She doesn't seem to care. And I talked about that in a lot of different podcasts. So the point is that men still do have the co-varying, sex and romance desire longer than a lot of women do, especially postmenopause. And postmenopause usually is when you're retired, right? And so at that time, unless you have a loving emotional connection, a close connection, then the woman really doesn't want any sex or romance, because she doesn't care. She doesn't feel close. So it's often, painful or difficult, and there's no desire in the way that there used to be. So at that juncture, it is the happy couples that remain close. Whereas before, even unhappy couples were usually having sex and hanging out and doing date nights, the couples that were in couples counseling, active conflict. The younger they are, the more they're having sex. And yes, many couples in couples counseling still have sex. Of course they do. All the young ones, almost all the young ones are still having sex, at least once or twice a week. And they still have plenty of other problems, but sex isn't one of them because they are both in their prime. And they're in the, the time where both women and men want to be sexually close. As I talked about in a previous podcast, they're in the intimacy versus isolation stage, right? And so this obviously also relates to that podcast of the generativity versus stagnation, right? And so a lot of people get into the post-retirement stage with totally different expectations. And the guy, especially if he has been told by her, remember, this is not like a malicious sort of fake thing, but many women think that when the demands of daily life are lessened, then they will probably want to be more romantic, right? But they don't have any idea how they're going to feel in the future because they don't know what it feels like to have your hormones change, right? And generally, your life perspective change. So it's not all your hormones. It's when you're 30, you think, oh, if we just didn't have the kids in the house, then we would have sex all the time. Yes, that's how you feel when you're 30. When you're 50, you've lived 20 more years, and that isn't what you want to do. You're a totally different person hormonally and frequently in every single way. A human being's going to be very, very different across a lifespan. And so if a man, particularly a preoccupied attachment man, was holding on to what she said, and I've seen this, when she's in her 30s, almost like he doesn't even check back because he thinks it's so obvious that they've already discussed it, that when the children leave the house, they're going to be closer sexually and romantically. And she's been changing that whole time. She doesn't even remember saying that. She doesn't even remember thinking it. It's like if you go back and I said, what did you think about when you were 8 years old? What were your daily thoughts? You could give me some bullshit, but if you went and looked back at your diary from when you were 8, you'd probably be shocked. Oh, I thought about this game, or I thought about that person. Who is that person again? That friend? That was my friend? So it's kind of like the same thing. So when men feel that the woman bait and switch them, of course, I have numerous podcasts about that, then they get upset. But the reality is nobody knows how they're going to change in the future. For example, a man would never at 20 be able to tell that at 40, he would be consumed with stress about his career to the point that he would be too anxious to have sex. And that does happen to many men. They get erectile dysfunction under stress, or their desire drops because they're just releasing so much cortisol all the time. From, let's say, they think they're going to get fired. They had some big mess up or something, at work, or they have something's going really wrong with your child. That's another big one. People have no idea how they're going to respond to their adult children. If your adult child is not doing well, it's terrible, and things happen to people that they could never have predicted. A good book that I read recently was Cost by Roxana Robinson, and it was a novel told from the perspective of many of the family members, but it was a family where the young adult son suffered with drug addiction, and so you see how that impacts every member of the family differently. And I work with a lot of people whose adult children are struggling in various ways, and or even their grandchildren. And that is, it's so much more important than you. It feels like that it's almost impossible to concentrate on yourself when your child is struggling. And women feel that frequently more than men do. Obviously a man doesn't like his child to struggle. There's that whole memoir of a guy with his drug-addicted son, actually A Beautiful Boy, I think is the name. And of course, men can devote themselves wholly to their adult children and their travails, etc. But from what I see in practice, unless something is incredibly severe, such as that, women are less able to just kind of take it in stride and compartmentalize their children's issues. And you never know what your children's issues will be, right? And then those come out when they are living out of the house and you feel, very anxious and upset and what have you. People have different perspectives on how much help to give and other things. And obviously there's a huge health component. So people have no idea how healthy physically or mentally they're going to be as they age. So basically the point is the closer you get to retirement, the more frequent and open your conversations need to be about retirement and about what this stage is going to do and how you're each thinking about this stage. And these conversations can frequently happen productively in couples counseling because often these things are taboo, or people don't even know what to ask, or they don't know what they don't know, or they feel that certain things are off the table. For example, a man would just be hoping against hope that his son doesn't move back home because he knows that if his young adult son were to move back home, she would become obsessed with him and want to hang out with him constantly, and then they would have no life together as a couple. But he knows that he, quote, can't say that because of how it would hurt her to think that he doesn't want the kid back home. But then what if the kid comes back home, right? It's going to be a devastation to the whole structure of the couple. And that could have been precluded by at least open discussions about expectations on both sides that could potentially inform what the choice is or what the boundaries are and so forth. And that's just one example of a million different things that are like that. And I have a podcast on when you have rules on what you could talk about and what you can't in couples counseling. So if you go into couples counseling, try not to have rules, things that you just can't say. Because it's almost like, what the hell's the point of even being couples counseling then, right? Because you're not being open. So obviously, lastly, there is a variable of, sometimes people really were waiting out the marriage until the kids left the house because they didn't want to upset their children by divorcing. And so sometimes when you're trying to create conversations and to open up space to discuss the post-retirement life as a couple, one partner will be very circumspect because they don't want to really think about it, and they have either implicitly, subconsciously, or consciously decided that they're going to be gone, when the kids leave the house. And obviously, statistically, more often that's the woman, but not always. In my practice, it's kind of half and half who would come in, because that's sometimes something that people want to discuss, is that decision. And I see that in men and women. You've lasted in something that you feel is fairly loveless or difficult or really stultifying for many decades, and you're waiting till the kids leave. And I have a post on when women do that specifically, why your wife stayed, got divorced. When your wife initiates divorce when the kids leave the house, I think is the name of the post. But anyway, sometimes you try to make these conversations happen and the other person really is quite vague. And the reason is because, they don't want to stay together. They know that either kind of in their core, or they've even thought about it. They've thought about leaving and moving out and what it's going to be like, but they do not want to stress the children. They feel like they've gotten to the home stretch and they do not want the children to be upset. So they want to remain together at least as long as the kids are there. And obviously that is something that really happens. It's not the majority of situations, as I've discussed all over my social media. The statistic that 50% of marriages end in divorce is not true. It's way overstated. You could Google that, 50% divorce rate myth. And particularly for many people that listen to me at higher education levels, college graduate, etc., the rate drops and drops, at higher education levels. So divorce is not common, is my point. It isn't as common, at least as people say. But so for the majority of people, they're figuring out how to remain together happily and move into a fulfilled stage of life together post-retirement, which is great. And I do have a podcast related to this on, do you and your spouse have the same hopes for the empty nester years? That's very, very similar to this one. And if you're just jonesing for more of this content, then that would be the next one to read about this. And I hope this was useful for you guys and it sparks some sort of, deeper thinking on this topic in your mind, which is what I hope to do. And I will talk to y'all soon. Have a great day.